Great to be joined now by Patrick Stevens, a contributor to the Washington Post and the Post's lead bracketologist. And I thought as we get started here in the month of February with the bubble talk and bracketology and everything really heating up, it's a good opportunity, Patrick, to catch up and talk about some of these local teams here to the Cincinnati area and where they stand as we get closer and closer to the month of March. But first of all, thank you for joining me today here on the Rebound Rundown. I appreciate you taking a few minutes here to talk.
Paul, thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. So let's get right into it here. And, we were talking before I came on the air about the teams that the Rebound Rundown covers. And if you look at Kentucky and Louisville, they're pretty safely into the tournament, but it's going to depend on seeding and things like that here down the stretch. Northern Kentucky obviously has to win the Horizon League in a one-bid league. Cincinnati and Dayton are slipping, but still not totally out of the picture yet. Xavier is the most intriguing team as far as the bubble goes right now on this show, and that's where I'm going to start with the Musketeers, who have 9 games remaining in the regular season, and right now they only have one quad 1 win. I think the UConn game could move up into quad 1. You might see Creighton rattle off some wins and get that home game in a few weeks back into quad 1. As we sit here right now, Xavier has a game against Georgetown on Tuesday night. The Musketeers, again, 9 games remaining in the regular season. First off, for Xavier, Patrick, what's your overall thought on the Musketeers?
Right now, I was just finishing up my bracket that runs Tuesdays in the Post, and I have Xavier as the team just outside of the tournament field. Basically, a team that hasn't done anything bad. The worst thing they've done all season is lose at Georgetown. The numbers maybe aren't great, particularly on the result-based metrics, but the win at Marquette does stand out. The interesting thing to me about Xavier is the fact that they're basically going to turn into, if things go right for them, sort of a quantity all-star here over the next month or so. The way that the Big East schedule sorted itself out, and I'm sure every Xavier fan knows this already. They're done with Connecticut, at least barring a Big East tournament appearance. Done with Marquette, done with St. John's, done going to Creighton. So, you could argue that the 7 toughest games on Xavier's conference schedule are already in the rearview mirror as February gets underway. And what that means is there's a lot of games that should be at least winnable, if not provide the opportunity for Xavier to rattle off, a 7-2 finish or something like that. I don't know if they can, but the opportunities are going to be there based on who remains on the schedule. I don't know if Xavier going 7-2 the rest of the way is any more or less impressive than going 5-6 to this point. But the reality is those are opportunities to go collect victories. And I think that is, compare that to, for example, to St. John's, which had a backloaded conference schedule as opposed to a front-loaded schedule. So to me, I think Xavier has a lot of opportunity here, maybe not necessarily to claim a whole lot all at once. I mean, that Creighton game at home is basically it from now until the Big East tournament. But I think there's opportunities to incrementally gain and maybe create a little bit of daylight from the edge of the field, but it's not going to be something that happens overnight. It'll be something that happens over the course of 4 or 5 weeks.
The other day after Xavier lost to Creighton, which I didn't think was a terrible game for Xavier by any means, they just ran into a Creighton team that went 8 for 10 from 3 in the second half. I tweeted after the game about Xavier maybe looking at a 9-0 finish to get into the NCAA tournament. And what I should have said in that tweet was to feel very comfortable about being in the NCAA tournament, because 8-1 or 7-2 certainly keeps you in the conversation there. Let's just say that 7-2 is the floor for this team. That would get you to 20 wins in the regular season, and it gets you to 20 before you worry about having to go to Madison Square Garden. What would you say would be the 2 losses that this team could afford to lose going down the stretch? When you look at, Villanova and Creighton, those are the best 2 teams that they play. But if you lose those games, it means you don't have those wins on your resume. At Providence, at Butler will be tough. What would you say there if somebody is holding out hope that a 7-2 finish could get them in? Where would those losses lie?
Well, it's important to remember you're talking about there's a whole bunch of other teams that are going to have a say in all of this too. So I don't want to pin anything too much on just a 7-2 being enough or not enough. But the good thing about the Big East this year, as opposed to the Big East last year, people talked about how could St. John's and Seton Hall have been left out last year. Well, a lot of it had to do with the fact that everybody in the league had 4 layups against Georgetown and DePaul. I mean, Georgetown's final net rating was like 208 and DePaul's was 320. And we're sitting here right now and, DePaul's at 131 and Seton Hall's at 193, but there's nobody quite as bad as those two teams. Maybe Seton Hall ends up down there ultimately. So what I would say for Xavier is the Creighton game is probably the one that wouldn't look as bad if you lost. The one game you absolutely need to win, well, 2 really. You need to beat DePaul at home and you need to win at Seton Hall. And then just a mass quantity from there. Just remember, all these other teams that are floating around the edge of the field are floating around the edge of the field because they're not really that consistent and they're not really that good for the most part. And so a lot of those teams are going to just sputter along around 500 in conference play the rest of the way as well. We're talking about teams like Central Florida and Georgia and Wake Forest, and Arizona State would be kind of in that mix. And, we could run down any number of teams, Pittsburgh, Nebraska. And so this is sort of the old story of, you're being chased by a bear with a bunch of other people, and you don't have to be the fastest person. You just have to have one person be slower than you. If you're Xavier, you just have to be good enough to be the 37th best at-large team. And obviously that's kind of a moving target as well. But ultimately, I do think that they're in a better position given the remaining schedule. If they're 7-2 the rest of the way, they're going to be in decent shape. I think. I don't know if it's guaranteed to be enough, but it certainly wouldn't be a situation where anyone's panicking like the season's over and you have to go win 3 or 4 games in a row.
Okay, so 2 more questions here, and these are more general. One is looking at the February stretch of this season, you kind of can sometimes as a fan get lost in there's the net, there's the strength of record, KPI, all these different metrics that people can talk about. But one other thing that's been added this year is the wins above the bubble. What would you say is something just for a general fan or a casual fan or somebody that kind of loosely keeps up with bracketology to understand what they need to pay attention to down the stretch of the season here?
I know the way I kind of look at it, and I think the committee looks at it, is the result-based metrics probably mean a little bit more. So the KPI, the strength of record, the wins above bubble, and the nets probably more is designed to be a little bit more of that than a predictive metric. And so right now, all of those are not in the top 50 for Xavier. The predictive metrics are all between 46 and 51. And so what I think the committee looks at as much as, are those result-based metrics kind of in keeping with sort of the rest of the field, and are there outliers? Like, is there one of those that kind of isn't quite the same as the rest? And if there's an outlier, then maybe you're a little more inclined to discount that and say the other 2 or 3 numbers are more reflective of what a team is. And so, part of the result-based metrics comes down to, what have you ultimately done? And I think for them, you kind of look at what they've done so far. They've won at Marquette and they've beaten Connecticut, and they've given very little reason to think that they're not a team that would be, they would be a team that would just not acquit themselves very well in the tournament. I mean, are you really holding losses at TCU by 4 points and at Georgetown by 6 points in this particular season against a team and saying that's just going to be terrible and no good at all? I do think if you're Xavier, one thing you would want to do on that team sheet is win a few more road games. And, to this point, they've won at Marquette, which is really good. They've won at DePaul, which frankly doesn't matter that much. And they got 4 more chances. And I think if you can figure out a way to get at least 2 of those, and really any 2, although let's face it, you need to get the Seton Hall game. that's probably going to kind of solve the question of, how good are these guys away from home. So if you get a split there, you're 4-8, and you split your two neutral site games. It's not something at that point that's going to be sitting there as an obvious sore thumb. At the end of the day, the other thing is the quad one wins, and there's not much you're really able to do about that right now. And that's why I say quantity is the thing you're almost counting on to be able to create daylight, because it's not necessarily going to be any more than 2, maybe 3, like you said with Creighton, the Creighton home game, that could be opportunities to get you there prior to the Big East tournament.
And to lead into that, this was the last general question I was going to ask before we move on to a couple more teams here. The Big East tournament or conference tournaments in general, I am of the opinion that you have to do your work before you get to the conference tournament, that the committee's made it pretty clear that wins in the conference tournament, unless you are right on the razor's edge, that they don't really matter. Am I correct or incorrect in that?
I think you're largely right. I think that obviously if you go win your conference tournament, that's a different thing. I think the thing that does matter in a conference tournament, and I think we saw this a little bit with some of the Mountain West teams last year, I think you can hurt yourself a fair bit if you go lose a game you absolutely shouldn't lose. So, I think at that stage, when you're looking at the last 4 or 5, 6 spots in the field, the committee is looking for differentiators, reasons as much to keep somebody out as to keep somebody in. If there's something, a blot of some kind, whether it's a terrible loss or an awful non-conference schedule or no road wins or what have you. And so much of that is already kind of baked in. So I agree with you that it's, unless it's the last couple spots, you're only going to gain so much. And some of it comes down to math, right? Like you play 31 games in the regular season, you're playing 1 or 2 or 3 probably conference tournament games. Conference tournament isn't more than 10% of your regular season. So it probably shouldn't count for much more than about 10% of what the committee's factoring in. And if it's only 2 games, it's not even that much. So I do agree with you on that sentiment.
All right, let's move on to Cincinnati, who at one point this season was 11th in the net. I know that was a long time ago. In fact, it might have been the first couple days that it was out. But they have plunged all the way to 53rd in the net as we sit here today. They are 0-6 in quad 1. They are 5-3 in quad 2 and don't have a quad 3 or 4 loss. But it feels like for the large part of January here, as they've now lost 8 of their last 10 games, they sit at 2-8 in the Big 12. Is Cincinnati officially, Patrick, in must-win the conference tournament territory, or where are the Bearcats right now?
Well, the problem there, you could sit there and say, well, there's plenty of opportunities that are sitting out there for this team over the next 5 weeks or so, right? I mean, it's a team that goes to Iowa State, it goes to West Virginia, it goes to Houston, it has Baylor at home, it has BYU at home, it goes to Central Florida. I mean, there's a lot of those games, but you got to win a bunch of them, and frankly, there just isn't that much evidence that this Cincinnati team is going to go win a bunch of those games. And so if you don't, and if you can't sit there and figure out a way to, I don't know, maybe go 6-4 the rest of the way or something along those lines, then you're basically in a spot where you're going to have to go win a lot of games when you get to the conference tournament, if not every game that you play there. So I think that by the time we get to mid-February and that Central Florida game and that BYU game and that Iowa State game have all been played, it'll be a little bit easier to determine whether it's 100%, go win five games or however many it is in Kansas City. But ultimately, I think for the Bearcats, like it's a daunting task given the teams that they would have to go out and play. But you do have those opportunities, like a victory over Houston, a victory over Iowa State, a victory over West Virginia, victory over BYU. Those are all things that would help a team out a lot. But you got to go get it, and so far it's not looking very good for Cincinnati at this stage.
Yeah, 5 quad 1 games remaining as we sit here today on February 3rd recording this. What has been maybe the most surprising thing to you about Cincinnati? I don't know how much of Cincinnati, I don't want to put you on the spot with how much you've watched of them this season, just individually in games, but just in general, as somebody that looks at their resume and kind of what's happened here in the month of January. What's the most surprising thing to you about this Cincinnati team and where they find themselves here now, just trying to scrape to get into the tournament?
I think one of the things that stands out is, at the end of the day, and this isn't so much a bracket belief as it is just sort of a personal belief, is that you have to score to be able to win. And to look at a team that had 50 against West Virginia, 52 against BYU, 40 against Kansas, 48 against Baylor, that's not a good offensive team. And I mean, I know some of those teams are really good at the defensive end, but when you see a team that just struggles to score like that, that tells you that it's probably kind of baked in at this point. Like, it's not just simply that you had two or three bad days that were interspersed, or you just ran into a couple buzzsaws along the way. When I see those sorts of offensive performances, and that's four of them in the last 8 games for this team, that tells you that it's going to be a really, really tough slog to figure out a way to be able to generate enough points to get enough wins to make yourself relevant when March arrives.
All right, let's move on to the Dayton Flyers, who were sitting at 23 in the net in mid to late December, and now sit at 73, 50 spots lower on February 3rd. The Flyers, are they in must-win territory in the A10 tournament, considering the fact they only have 2 games against VCU remaining, and those are really your only significant games left this year? Quad 1 game against VCU on the last game of the season at VCU. But other than that, you're talking about a team that has 2 Quad 4 games on the schedule, 4 Quad 3 games, and 2 in Quad 2.
Yeah, there just aren't many opportunities in this version of the Atlantic 10 to be able to really improve your at-large stock. And I think that goes for just about everybody in the conference. I'm not sure anybody in the league, with the possible exception of a VCU that gets on a roll here over the final 5 weeks or so of the regular season, and then gets bounced in, say, the semis or the final of the A10 tournament, has any kind of a realistic shot at an at-large berth. And so you look at Dayton, like the loss at UMass is just really, really bad. And so that's 1 Quad 3 loss right there. Excuse me. The numbers, the metrics, all the team sheet metrics, none of them are in the top 50. One of them's in the top 60. Yeah, the victories over Marquette and Connecticut are nice. It would be great for them if that meant that they had a head start in amassing a resume to get a good seat in the Big East tournament. But that's not what we're talking about here. And so I think for Dayton, it's the plan at this point has to be figure out a way to get a top 4 seed in the A10 tournament and then go win 3 games in 3 days. I mean, I think that has to be the priority. I also think that's a very achievable priority given how the rest of the league has set itself up to this point. I don't know if there's a great team in the A10. There's a fair number of decent ones. Like I think that St. Bonaventure is spunky. I think George Mason, a team that I see a lot here in the D.C. area, has an excellent defense. VCU's obviously dangerous. St. Louis has pieces. But I don't know if there's anybody that you just sit there and say, well, they're just going to breeze through 3 games in 3 days in D.C. come March. I think Dayton can still get there, but they've obviously gone through a tough stretch in the first half of conference play.
All right, let's close this with a couple of quick thoughts on the teams from the Bluegrass State. We're going to start with Louisville. Louisville right now sits at 10-6 in quads 1 and 2. They don't have a quad 3 or 4 loss. They don't play a quad 1 game the rest of the regular season here down the stretch. Louisville as a team is sitting at 29th in the net. They have had an unbelievable season in their first year under Pat Kelsey. Louisville is back on the map in a big way, especially in a weak ACC this year. What do you think the seed ceiling is for this Louisville team, Patrick?
Yeah, as you say, like the big issue for Louisville is there aren't as many opportunities to improve their lot in life. I mean, you look at those games the rest of the way. I mean, I would say they only play one game against a possible NCAA tournament team the rest of the season, and that's Pittsburgh on March 1st at home. And so I think when you look at that schedule, it's just there's just a bunch of landmines around there, right? Like, I mean, you can't lose to Miami at home, you can't lose to Cal at home, and so I don't know how much higher they're going to be able to get than maybe if they're fortunate, maybe a 5 seed or a 6 seed. Even with a lot of those wins, we were talking earlier about Xavier just sort of making incremental growth, but with their lot in life over the next month or so, Louisville just isn't going to gain that much by even, say, beating Notre Dame on the road or winning at NC State or beating Stanford. They're going to have to just pile up victories here, and so I think a 5 seed is probably the ceiling for these guys unless they go win the ACC tournament. I mean, the reality is that the holy grail in this year's ACC is figuring out a way to beat Duke. And so if you get that, then that's going to improve your perception instantly. That might be one of those exceptions to the conference tournament isn't going to help you very much. But everybody else, even a game like a Clemson on a neutral court, isn't going to help you that much. So I'm thinking probably a 5 seed is probably about as good as Louisville can hope for. Maybe they prove me wrong and do a little bit better, but there just isn't much that's really going to help them. They're basically in a mode for the next month of trying not to hurt themselves.
All right, and then the last team to talk about here is Kentucky, who just took a loss the other night to Arkansas. They've lost 3 out of 4 here over the last couple of weeks. Now, not bad losses. They lost to Alabama, they lost to Vanderbilt, and then that loss to Arkansas, which is the quad 2 loss in there. I mean, if you look at their season, it's the only loss that Kentucky has outside of quad 1 this year. But what is your thought on Kentucky?
Well, all those SEC teams are benefiting from the fact that, they go play each other, and most of those losses don't hurt very much, and so many of the wins help. Like, you give Kentucky a week last week where they went and won at Tennessee and lost at home to Arkansas. That's a net plus for Kentucky. Like, you're better off with those 2 results than you were going in. So, they have a victory over Duke. They've beaten Florida. They've beaten Gonzaga. They've beaten Texas A&M. They've won at Mississippi State. They've beaten Louisville. Even with 3 losses in 4 games, that is a really enviable profile. Do I think Kentucky is consistent enough to be able to get itself up to the 1 line? Probably not. But I don't think anybody should be surprised if Kentucky ends up within one line of the 3 line, no matter what happens. I shouldn't say no matter what happens, but in all likelihood, they're a team that's not going to collapse. And so you kind of look at every game just about the rest of the way for them as an opportunity. Maybe playing South Carolina at home and LSU at home isn't. But just about every other game gives them some sort of value to add to their profile. And like I said, I don't think that's a team that's going to collapse. Obviously, Saturday was a tough one for them. But they're a team that, they've been in most of the games that they've played this season. Throw out that Ohio State game and maybe the Georgia game too, and they've been in the mix. So I suspect that Kentucky is a team that we're going to see, on the 3 line plus or minus a line when all is said and done. And unless there is some sort of collapse, it's really hard to envision. They're not going to slip too much further than that.
Patrick, I appreciate you taking a few minutes this morning to talk all about these teams and where they sit right here as we get into February. Tell the people that are listening where they can find your work, social media, if they want to read what you're doing, where they can find you.
You can find me, find my work at the Washington Post /sports, and I'm on Blue Sky at Discourse. Replace the I with a 1, so DISCOURSE.bluesky.social.
All right. Well, Patrick, I appreciate it, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you much.